It all began on a Monday morning, inside that building, on the fourth floor. Sat a man named Joseph Ellis. He was the kind of man who didn't speak unless there was something worth saying, the kind who brought warmth without noise, who wore dark suits and a humble smile, and who arrived early, always. Long before the coffee machine had time to gurgle awake, Joseph was black. He had worked in that company for over 17 years. He knew every floorboard creak in the hallway, every short circuit in the printer, every team member's coffee order, and more importantly, every nuance of the projects they handled. His presence wasn't loud, but it was steady, like the quiet tick of a reliable clock in a room you'd miss if it ever stopped ticking. But then, a change came. The company announced a new branch manager, Thomas Avery. Sharp suit, a clean smile, eyes that scanned a room like a ledger, white, well-spoken, and young. Promoted quickly from another district. He was the kind of man who liked fast decisions, fresh starts. He wanted change, crisp, immediate, and noticeable. And on his first day, he noticed Joseph. Or rather, he didn't. He saw a quiet man, older, worn suits. It's not very assertive in meetings. Someone who blended into the corners, who listened more than he spoke. To Thomas, Joseph seemed outdated, unremarkable, replaceable, and so, by the end of the second week, Thomas made a decision, not based on performance, not on feedback, but based on a feeling, a cold, calculated feeling that Joseph didn't fit the new direction. He called Joseph into his office on a Wednesday. It was raining that day. Joseph entered quietly, umbrella dripping gently in the hallway. Thomas didn't ask him to sit, didn't offer tea, just slid a beige envelope across the table and said, "We're letting you go, Joseph. Your position has been restructured out. It's time for a new chapter for both of us." Joseph stood still. His hands didn't shake. His breath didn't rise. He simply nodded once, slowly. Then, in a voice soft like late-night radio, he said, "I see." There was no pleading no. Argument, just silence. And rain against glass. Later that evening, long after most had gone home, cleaning crew would find Joseph's desk cleared, nothing left but a folded paper crane, and a small framed photo of a little girl on a swing, his daughter. Over the following weeks, Thomas restructured the team, recruited younger analysts, installed new software, held high energy. Morning briefings with slides and slogans. Things felt new, glossy, promising. But soon, little cracks began to show. A client called twice to clarify a project detail, something Joseph always handled with a single email. A junior analyst fumbled the accounting log Joseph used to triple-check it by memory. Meetings ran longer. Deadlines edged further. The calm had been replaced by noise. And one evening, as Thomas sat alone in his office reviewing a quarterly report, he reached instinctively for the intercom. He was about to ask Joseph for a projection, but stopped halfway. The room reminded him, gently, that Joseph was no longer there. The quiet had gone. Outside, the rain returned, and inside, Thomas felt something stir, a flicker, faint, unwelcome. A thought he didn't say aloud. Did I make a mistake? Replaced by the rustle of papers and the buzz of his phone, the persistent ticking of the clock. And while the building outside grew brighter under longer days, something inside the office began to dim. At first it was subtle missed memos. Misfiled forms, a growing pile of unanswered client requests. The kind of details that Joseph used to quietly smooth over without ever needing applause. Thomas noticed, but only in passing. He assumed it was part of the adjustment period. Every team took time to fall into rhythm, he told himself. But beneath the fluorescent lights and polite smiles, the rhythm was gone. The team had changed, not just in structure, but in spirit. Where there had once been calm confidence, now there was tension. Uncertainty, the kind of tension that lives in the silence after someone's voice disappears from the room. Junior team member Alina began staying late to manage extra files. She tried her best, but even she couldn't find Joseph's. Old color-coded notes, his handwritten margin comments, his soft reminders that used to appear like magic before meetings. And as she stood one evening by the printer, watching papers spill in crooked stacks, she whispered to no one in particular, "I miss him." In another room, a client named Mr. Callahan was calling for the third time that month. His voice was cordial, but clipped. He had worked closely with Joseph on sensitive accounts for nearly 5 years. "I don't mean to be difficult," he said to Thomas over the phone, but Joseph knew how to make things seamless. Thomas nodded even though no one could see him. "Yes, I understand," he said. "We're transitioning." Mr. Callahan paused, then quietly, "You let go of the wrong man, Mr. Avery?" That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat at his apartment window with the lights off. Watching the streetlights flicker against the parked cars, he tried to convince himself it was just nostalgia, that change always ruffled feathers, that Joseph had been quiet, slow, outdated. But something inside him, something honest, began to whisper Joseph wasn't slow. He was steady. He wasn't outdated. He was timeless, and slowly, painfully. Thomas realized what he had done. It wasn't about race, he told himself at first, but then, why had he dismissed Joseph without cause? Why had he assumed less competence, less presence, just by looking at him? He remembered the first time he saw Joseph sitting alone at his desk, warm eyes, dark skin, quiet energy, and he remembered the instant judgment he'd made. Doesn't fit. He hadn't even tried to see more. The next morning, Thomas arrived early, earlier than usual. He walked past Joseph's old desk, now occupied by a temp, paused. There was a strange emptiness there, not in the desk, but in the air, the feeling of something gone, irreversible. He walked into his office, sat down, and opened Joseph's old personnel file. It was full of glowing reviews, commendations, handwritten notes from clients, and even one holiday card with a child's crayon drawing, his daughter's her name was written in shaky letters. For Daddy, from Mara. Thomas held the paper in his hands and closed his eyes. A heaviness settled in his chest, one he couldn't name, but couldn't deny. For the rest of the day he was distracted, not by emails or meetings or phone calls, but by regret, not just for what he'd done, but for who he had failed to see, not just a man, but a father, a mentor, a quiet pillar, a presence that had held the floor steady. Even as others had walked too quickly to notice, a few days passed, and the thought didn't leave him. In fact, it grew. Regret has a strange way of nesting in the quiet, not loud or accusatory, but persistent. Soft as a shadow at sunset, but always there by the end of the week. Thomas couldn't stand the wait anymore. He asked HR for Joseph's forwarding address. They hesitated, it wasn't policy. But eventually, they handed him a simple mailing label. Joseph Ellis, P.O. Box 4213, Linden Hills. Linden Hills, a neighborhood just outside the city, old, quiet, where houses had picket fences and porches where wind chimes sang softly in the breeze. That Saturday, Thomas went. He didn't plan what to say. He didn't even know if Joseph would be there. But his conscience had finally grown louder than his pride. He found the address, a small brick house with ivy trailing around the windows. The garden was neat, modest, peaceful. He stood at the gate for a long time. Then he saw her, a little girl with thick curls and caramel skin swinging gently from an old wooden swing. She looked exactly like the drawing in the personnel file. Mara, his heart dropped. Behind her, a man stepped out, graying hair, calm face, worn jeans, and a navy sweater. Joseph, the man looked directly at Thomas and didn't flinch. For a moment, the world stood still. No noise, no breeze, just two men, and all the things unspoken between them. Thomas cleared his throat. "Joseph," he began, I came to say I'm sorry." The words felt small, too. Small. Joseph didn't move. His eyes didn't narrow in anger, but neither did they warm. He simply stood. A quiet tower of patience. Waiting, Thomas continued. voice lower now. I made a mistake. I judged you without reason, and I see it now. Not just the harm I did to the company, but the harm I did to you. As a man, as a human being, he looked down. I can't take it back, but I needed to say it, face to face. Joseph was quiet for a long time. Then in the same soft voice he had always spoken with, he said, "You didn't just take a job. From me, Thomas, you took away the dignity of 17 years, not with words, but with silence." Thomas swallowed hard. "I know." Joseph looked at Mara, who was still swinging, small feet brushing over leaves. "But I also know what it means to forgive," he said. "Not for you, but for me." There was no anger in his voice, only stillness, only truth. Thomas nodded slowly, eyes stinging with something unfamiliar. Humility. "Thank you for listening," he whispered. Joseph gave a quiet nod in return, then turned, gently, and walked back toward the porch, his daughter running behind him. Laughter in the wind. Thomas didn't follow. He stood there at the gate, watching, and for the first time in a long while he felt small, but not in a way that asked for pity. In a way that asked for change. That night, Thomas didn't write an email. He didn't issue an apology memo. He sat down and wrote a letter to Joseph, to Mara, to himself. He wrote, not for resolution, but for reflection. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from being forgiven. Sometimes it comes from finally understanding what you broke and choosing to carry that truth, quietly, honestly, for the rest of your life. The days after that visit moved slowly for Thomas. He returned to work with a quieter posture. Not defeated, but changed, more careful, more human. He no longer raced through meetings. He listened, truly listened. He noticed the quiet, once more the ones like Joseph used to be, the ones who didn't interrupt or fight to be seen, and he began to wonder often how many others like Joseph he had overlooked in his life. Elena saw the shift first, one morning, after a presentation. Thomas stopped her by the door. "Elena," he said softly, "you remind me of someone." She tilted her head. "Good someone?" "The best kind." Then he handed her a small notebook, old, leather bound. Inside were Joseph's project notes, thoughts scribbled in margins, solutions written in shorthand. "I found it in the back of a drawer," he said. "I think it's time someone else learned from it." Lena opened it carefully, touched. She didn't ask why it wasn't returned to Joseph. She understood. Some things aren't returned, they're remembered. Meanwhile, Joseph's life moved forward. 2. He had found quiet work in a community center in Linden Hills, mentoring youth, helping with resumes, teaching business basics on weekends. He didn't talk about the past much, but sometimes, when the wind blew right through the open windows, he would pause mid-sentence and look out, as if remembering something left behind, not with bitterness, but with bittersweet memory. Mara was growing fast. She had Joseph's eyes calm, seeing everything, saying little. One night, as she curled beside him on the old couch, she asked, "Daddy, why don't you work in the big buildings anymore?" Joseph smiled. "Because now," he said, "I build something different." "What?" He tapped her chest gently. "Confidence. In little hearts like yours." She giggled and hugged him tighter. That night, as she fell asleep, Joseph sat quietly, watching the moonlight stretch across the living room floor, and for the first time in a long time, he felt peace. Elsewhere, Thomas continued his letter-writing habit. He never sent them, but he wrote them, dozens over the months. To Joseph, to Mara, to Mara, to Mara, to other names he barely remembered, but now thought of with clarity. In one letter, he wrote, "You didn't raise your voice, Joseph, but somehow, your silence taught me more than any reprimand ever could. It taught me to look deeper, to see the human being behind the job title, behind the skin." Another letter ended with, "I will carry this weight," not as punishment, but as purpose. He kept them all in a small wooden box on his bookshelf. He never showed anyone, but each time he opened that box, he remembered one autumn afternoon as The leaves turned the color of copper and cinnamon. Thomas stood outside a community hall in Linden Hills. He had been invited, indirectly, to a local mentorship event. He didn't expect to see Joseph, but there he was, standing by a table, organizing flyers, speaking kindly to a group of young men. Joseph caught sight of him. He gave a faint nod, not warm, not cold. Just enough to say, "I see you trying." And for Thomas, that was enough. He didn't approach, he didn't speak, he just stood quietly, watching the man he had once dismissed now building future sin a way Thomas never could. Sometimes redemption doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it comes with humility, time, and the echo of a man's integrity, still ringing long after he has left the room. Winter came softly that year. In Linden Hills, frost gathered gently on windowsills, and breath turned visible in the early morning air inside Joseph's home. Warmth lived in small things, the crackle of old radiators, Mara's, laughter skipping down the hallway, and the scent of cinnamon tea steeping in a chipped white mug. Life had grown slower, simpler. But Richard Joseph had built a routine, not rushed or pressured like before. He taught part-time at the center and helped elderly neighbors with their taxes in exchange for warm pie or hand-knitted scarves. But what no one saw, not even his closest friends, was that some part of him still carried the echo of that office, not the bitterness, not the pain, but the memory of how quietly a man could be erased when no one is truly watching. He kept a small notebook of his own now, filled with names of the young people he mentored. Beside each name, he'd write notes. Marcus listens better when asked instead of told. Kayla, brilliant with numbers, just needs one adult to believe in her. Andre hides behind jokes, heart too big to show. Each page was filled with quiet understanding. Of those society often overlooked, he knew what that felt like. And he was determined no child he crossed paths with would feel the same. Back in the city, Thomas was still learning how to carry his guilt without letting it crush him. He didn't seek praise for his changes. He didn't post about diversity or issue grand public statements. Instead, he quietly promoted to overlooked employees. He restructured performance reviews to remove unconscious bias. He read deeply about systems he once claimed didn't exist. But most of all, he listened more, spoke less. It was not redemption. Not yet, but it was the start of repair. One snowy evening, as he left the office late, Thomas walked past a bakery still open on the corner. A sign in the window read, "Support local, respect roots." And beside it, on the bulletin board, was a flyer. Community Career Night, hosted by Joseph Ellis and the Linden Hills Youth Initiative. You are more than what they see. Thursday, 6 p.m. All welcome. Asterisk, asterisk. Thomas stared at the paper for a long time. It wasn't flashy, wasn't bold. Just like Joseph, still building, still giving, still standing tall without needing a spotlight. Thomas smiled, not with happiness, but with something deeper, a quiet gratitude. That Joseph hadn't been destroyed by what happened. That despite everything, he'd chosen to continue rising. That Thursday, Thomas didn't go. He wanted to, every part of him did. But something in him knew. This wasn't about being seen. Trying it was about stepping back, letting others shine. So instead, he made a different choice. He sent a donation anonymous to the Youth Initiative. No card. No note. Just enough to buy new computers, fresh books, and a year's worth of warm meals for the students. It wasn't a fix, it wasn't penance, but it was a beginning. Back in Linden Hills, Joseph opened a letter from the community center. They'd received an unexpected donation, enough to cover expansion, costs, and build a small library corner for the teens. He looked at the total, his brow lifted. There was no name, but something in his chest stirred, a whisper of a thought, a man trying. Quietly, he said nothing, only nodded and tucked the letter into his notebook. between Kayla's page and Andre's. Then he went back to work, because there were still so many names to write, so many lives to lift, so many stories to rewrite by. Early spring. The city began to thaw. Ice melted from the rooftops. Children's voices returned to parks in tiny green shoots, poke their heads bravely through the ground, unaware of the harsh winter that had come before at Joseph's house. The swing creaked again with regular use, and Mara had learned to jump off at midair, legs flailing, laughter trailing behind. She was growing up fast, too fast, Joseph sometimes thought, but every time he saw her face light up, he was reminded this was what mattered now. Not the titles, not the missed promotions, not even the injustice that had knocked him down once, but what he stood for, and what she would come to stand for because of him. Far away, in a quiet apartment, above the city, Thomas was finishing a letter. It was the longest one he'd ever. It's written not to HR, not to Joseph, not to the board, but to himself. He didn't start with Dear Thomas. He started with, This is who you were, and this is who you must never be again. The letter wasn't easy. He wrote about the assumptions, the blindness that wasn't just personal, but inherited. The moment he'd looked at a quiet, brilliant black man had only seen what centuries of bias had taught him to see. He wrote about the cost of ignorance, not just to Joseph, but to the company, the team, and his own soul. He ended it with, You lost something that day, eh? Teacher you never recognized, and a man whose absence taught you more than his presence ever could. Because you failed to listen while he was still near, you owe him. But more than that, you owe every person you will meet after him, to see better, to listen louder, and to never again confuse quiet for weakness. He folded the pages slowly, placed them in a drawer, not to hide them, to remember. Some apologies are too sacred to send. They must live inside you like seeds, quietly growing at the community center, as things were blooming too. Joseph now led a weekly group called The Unseen for teenagers who had felt invisible in schools, homes, or crowded streets. He didn't lecture, he asked questions, and he listened. One boy, shy and stiff-shouldered, asked him after a session, Did they ever make you feel small, sir? Joseph smiled softly. They tried. The boy blinked. And did they win? Joseph looked toward the window where Mara was helping an elderly. Volunteer carry books. No, he said. They just taught me how tall I could stand. That night, Joseph sat alone in his study, the lamp casting warm gold light across his hands. He opened his old work notebook, now repurposed as a memory log. He flipped past pages of project notes, old calculations, even sticky tabs from client. Calls at the back on a blank page, he wrote, To the man who let me go. You did not end my story, you just redirected it. He closed the notebook gently, not with finality, but with peace, because some endings are really just quiet beginnings in disguise. Years passed like pages turned in a well-loved book softly, gently, without noise. Mara was 11 now, still. Curious, still kind. She asked more questions these days, not just about homework, but about people, fairness, and why some things in the world felt. Tilted Joseph always answered honestly, even when it hurt. One evening she asked, Why didn't you fight when they fired you? Joseph looked up from the dishes, warm water dripping from his hands. He thought for a moment, then knelt beside her. Because I knew something they didn't. What's that? He smiled. The people who build quietly don't fall easily, and that my worth wasn't theirs to take. She looked into his eyes and nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Meanwhile, in the city, Thomas had started mentoring interns. It wasn't a grand gesture. He didn't do it for its redemption. He did it because he knew he couldn't erase what he had done. But maybe, just maybe, he could prevent it from happening again. One intern, a soft-spoken black student named Elijah, reminded him of someone. Elijah was brilliant, precise, patient. In their third meeting, Thomas asked gently, Has anyone made you feel unseen here? Elijah hesitated, then nodded. Sometimes, but I'm used to it. Thomas's heart sank, but he didn't flinch. You shouldn't have to be. He paused. This place should see you. Later that week, Thomas opened his notebook, the same one where he'd written all those unsent letters. He wrote one more. This time, to Elijah. He didn't sign it, just left it in the young man's inbox. Your presence matters. Your voice matters. Don't shrink for anyone. Don't wait to be recognized. Take your space, son. And if the world hesitates, remind it who you are. Elijah never asked who sent it, but he carried it with him, in Linden Hills. Joseph walked into the youth center one day and found a large package waiting. No return address. Inside, 10 brand new laptops, stack of notebooks, and one single envelope. The note inside was typed. For the voices you help raise, keep building, brick by quiet brick. No name, but Joseph smiled. Because some people change without needing to be seen doing it. And sometimes, the ones who cause the harm. Learn how to help, silently. By now. Joseph had become something of a legend in the neighborhood. Not because he sought it, but because true strength doesn't whisper forever. Eventually, the world leans in to listen. Spring deepened, and with it came a new season of growth at the community center. Paint was fresh on the walls. New books filled the shelves, and the kids laughed louder in the courtyard. It was as if the walls themselves were healing from years of being. Unseen, Joseph stood beneath the old elm tree out front, clipboard in hand, checking off volunteers for the upcoming Youth Futures Fair. It was his favorite event of the year, a day where teenagers could dream out loud and meet professionals who reminded them their lives had value, purpose, and possibility. That year, they'd invited professionals from across the city quietly, carefully, through allies who'd grown to believe in the mission. One name caught Joseph's eye on the list. A name he hadn't seen in years, Thomas Avery, business consultant. Workshop. What makes leadership worth following? Joseph stared at it for a moment, then nodded once, as if to say, all right then. See. When Thomas arrived that Thursday, he didn't wear his usual tailored suit, no polished presentation, no flashy title slide. He came with nothing but a notepad and open hands. As he stood before the crowd of teens, some bored, some hopeful, some unsure, he didn't speak like a man trying to impress. He spoke like a man trying to repair. I once thought leadership was about control, he began. About being the smartest voice in the room, but then I met someone who taught me. Leadership is actually about who you choose to lift up. I made a mistake once. I let someone go, not because they weren't good enough, but because I never took the time to understand how great they really were. The room grew still. Some teens looked up, others leaned forward, and Joseph, standing just beyond the back row, folded his arms quietly. Thomas didn't mention Joseph's name. Not once. He didn't need to. The message rang clear, clean, and deeply felt. He wasn't there to cleanse his guilt. He was there to tell a room full of future leaders, don't be like me. See people before it's too late. When he finished, he stepped off the small stage and turned only to find Joseph standing there. Hands in his coat pockets, their eyes met. For a long, silent second. And then, Joseph offered a small nod, one filled with gravity, and released not quite forgiveness, not absolution, but recognition. A silent man saying to a formerly blind one, you finally see. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the row houses and music played softly from the fairground, Thomas walked toward his car. He heard footsteps behind him. It was Joseph this time, spoke first. That was the first time I heard you speak without trying to lead. Thomas looked down, a slow breath leaving him. I wasn't there to lead. Good, Joseph said. Because these kids don't need more leaders. They need listeners, builders, protectors. Nodded slowly. I'm learning. Joseph looked toward the center where children were packing up chairs and folding tables. So am I, he said. Every day. Then quietly, thank you for showing up. Thomas looked at him. Thank you for not staying silent forever. They shook hands. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, just two men acknowledging the road between them, and how far they'd walked since the weeks after the youth futures. Fare felt different in Linden Hills. A few of the teens from the event had started visiting the community center more often. They didn't always come to talk. Sometimes they just sat. Other times, they asked questions they'd been holding for years. How do I deal with people who don't believe in me? What if I'm always the only one who looks like me in the room? Does being good even matter if they never see it? And Joseph, in his usual way, didn't rush to answer. He let the silence stretch, soft and safe. Then he'd say something, gentle, something small, but enough to stay. Being good always matters, especially when they don't see it. They don't need to see you right now. Just don't stop shining. There's power in being underestimated. Just don't. Let it shrink you. Back in the city. Thomas had stepped back from corporate life. He now worked part-time with nonprofit initiatives, quietly connecting companies to community centers, mentorship programs, and education grants. He didn't use Joseph's name and proposals didn't mention his past, but every project he touched carried the fingerprint of the lesson he'd learned, and quietly. He'd started visiting other offices, speaking not to boardrooms, but to hiring managers and senior leads. His message was always the same. You don't lose good people because they fail. You lose them because you never looked closely enough.
Sometimes.
People nodded. Other times, they just blinked. It's uncomfortable, but he kept saying it anyway. Because once you've broken something sacred, you either hide from it forever, or you spend the rest of your life teaching others how not to make the same mistake. One afternoon, Joseph received a letter in the mail. It was from a teen named Marcus, now in his first year of college. Sir, you probably don't remember this, but once you told me that people like me don't have to roar to be heard, I didn't believe you back then, but now, my quiet's finally being heard. Thank you for seeing me. Joseph read it twice, then tucked it into the same notebook where Mara's childhood. Drawings still lived, the same notebook where Thomas's name appeared only once, but where his impact echoed through every page. That night, as the sky turned the color of indigo and stars blinked awake, Joseph sat on the porch with Mara. She was older now, 12 going on 20, feet curled beneath her, reading a book about young inventors. "Daddy?" she asked, without looking up. "Yes. Do you think people really change?" He smiled, sipping his tea. "Sometimes, if the hurt they caused wakes something deep enough inside them, like Mr. Avery." Joseph paused, then nodded. Double quotes. "Yes." "Like him? Do you forgive him?" Joseph looked out at the quiet street, lit by golden porch lamps and the occasional passing car. "I don't carry him anymore," he said softly. "That's enough." And in that moment, with the night soft around them and the past folded neatly behind him, Joseph felt something close. Not a chapter, not a door, but a wound. Finally healing, it was a rainy day in late autumn when Joseph received an email he hadn't expected. The subject line was simple: guest invitation, City Equity Summit. The message read, "Dear Mr. Ellis, we would be honored to have you speak at the City Equity Summit this December. Your quiet leadership and your work in underserved communities have been cited by several panelists as a model of dignity and impact. No formal presentation needed, just your voice. Organizing Committee, City Equity Alliance." Joseph blinked. He had never sought platforms, never wanted stages, but somehow, his life had made its way there anyway, not through noise, but through truth. He closed the laptop slowly and stared out the window. Raindrops rolled steadily down the glass, the same rhythm they had once made on the office window the day he was let go. He breathed in, held the moment, and clicked reply.
I accept, thank you.
2 weeks later, he stood backstage in a quiet hall. The lights were low, the crowd hushed, and the air carried the scent of warm wood and distant coffee. He hadn't brought a speech, just his notebook. In the front row sat Mara, now in her first year of high school, taller, wiser, holding his coat in her lap, and beside her, almost out of sight, sat a man with gray at his temples. Thomas, not on the agenda, not in the spotlight, just there, present, not to be seen. But to witness, Joseph stepped up to the small podium. He looked out at a sea of faces, some familiar, some curious, some skeptical. Then he spoke. I wasn't supposed to be here years ago. I was let go from a job where I had given 17 years of my life. Not because I failed, but because I was never truly seen. Because of what I looked like, not what I carried inside me. I didn't fight. I left quietly and I rebuilt. Not out of anger, but out of truth. The truth that what was taken from me could never take away who I was. The room was still, not tense, but leaning in. He continued, the man who let me go is here today. We don't need to name him because this story isn't about revenge. It's about recognition. It's about what happens when someone chooses to see differently even. If it comes too late, and what happens when those of us who were pushed aside choose to keep building anyway. He paused, then said softly, justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes walk slowly in quiet men with steady hearts and daughters who ask brave questions.
Oh.
Mara smiled quietly in the dark. When the applause came, it wasn't explosive. It was warm. True, the kind of applause meant not for a performer, but for a life well lived. Afterward, in the hallway near the exit, Thomas approached Joseph. They didn't shake hands this time. They just stood side by side, looking out at the rainy parking lot. You didn't have to mention me, Thomas said. Quietly, Joseph nodded. I didn't, but sometimes even regret deserves its place in the story. Thomas turned to him. Do you hate me? Joseph smiled gently. Double quotes, no. I outgrew that. And forgiveness. Joseph's eyes softened. Not a gift I hand out. It's a state I choose to live in. Thomas looked down. Thank you. Joseph placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Live well, Thomas. Let your ripple count for something. And with that, he walked toward the door where Mara was waiting. Outside, the rain had slowed. Just a soft mist now, dancing in the streetlights. Father and daughter walked home together, side by side, not away from the past, but forward, into a future they had built, not out of what was given, but out of what had been reclaimed, with quiet strength, with dignity, with love. Winter pressed in gently around Linden Hills. The streets wore coats of frost, bare trees whispered in the wind, and smoke curled from chimney tops like memories released into the sky. Inside Joseph's small home, warmth bloomed in every corner, not because it was filled with things, but because it was filled with peace. Mara was decorating the window with paper snowflakes. Humming softly, Joseph watched her, his heart full in that quiet way, like a cup not overflowing, just perfectly held. He had come far, not in miles, but in truth. The world had once tried to reduce him to a footnote, but now, through every life he touched, every hand he lifted, he had become a chapter in other stories in the city. Thomas had made a decision. He resigned from his old corporate life entirely. He now worked full-time with underserved youth, the kind of teens he used to overlook. He taught interview prep, wrote college recommendations, and most importantly, learned how to listen. There was no plaque on his desk, no title, just a notebook that read, Names I Must Never Forget. One day, he received a letter. It was handwritten, from Mara. Mr. Avery, I'm writing this not because you asked, but because you matter in this story too. My father says you changed. I believe him. I know what you did, and I know what you do now. I think the world needs both parts of your story, the mistake and the making right, because a lot of people make mistakes, but very few go back and fix them. I hope you keep fixing things. There are a lot of us still waiting to be seen. Thomas held the letter for a long time, then folded it gently and placed it in the same drawer where his oldest letter, the one to himself, still lived, at the community center. Joseph began hosting Sunday circles. No sign dash up, no cost, just an open space for men to gather. Fathers, sons, brothers, strangers. They sat in silence sometimes. Other times, they told the truth about how hard it is to be unseen, about what it means to be dismissed and what it takes to still choose kindness. Over bitterness, one evening, a young man asked, "How do you keep from getting angry at the world?" Joseph smiled faintly. "I let the anger move through me," he said, "but I don't let it build my house." He looked around the circle. "We don't build our house out of pain. We build it from who we are when no one's watching."
It's
Was still sacred, a silence full of strength. That night, the snow began to fall again. Joseph sat with Mara by the fire. She rested her head on his shoulder. "Did you ever think this is where you'd end up?" she asked sleepily. He looked at her, warmth in his eyes. "No," he whispered, "but it's exactly where I was meant to be. Because sometimes the hardest losses in life lead you home." The years passed gently, like pages turned with reverence. Mara was 17 now. Her curls were longer, her voice stronger. She spoke up in class, led youth workshops at the center, and sometimes sat beside Joseph in Sunday circles, not as a child, but as a voice of her own. Joseph had grown older, but not smaller. If anything, he carried more light now, not in his words, but in the way people paused when he entered a room. He'd become a kind of myth in the neighborhood, the man who was once let go quietly and returned louder through the lives he lifted. One crisp evening in October, Mara came home with a folded letter in her hand. It was from a university, one she had dreamed of quietly for years, but never said aloud. Fearing it might float away, she handed it to Joseph without a word. He opened it slowly and smiled. They said yes. She nodded, trying to be calm, but her eyes brimmed with tears. "They said yes, Dad." He stood and hugged her tight, hands steady on her back. Not because of the acceptance, but because he knew what it meant. She was seen truly, and on her way to places he had once only imagined for her. That night, Joseph sat alone on the porch under the stars. He opened his notebook one last time, the same one that had followed him. Through years of quiet battles and quiet triumphs, he flipped through pages filled with names and memories. Drawings, notes from youth he'd mentored near the end. There was one blank page left. He picked up his pen and wrote, "The man who once dismissed me will likely never know the full reach of what he set in motion, but I do not carry hate for him, because from that silence I built something sacred. My daughter will walk into rooms, was never allowed in. She will be respected, not because I demanded it, but because I lived it. And maybe that's how healing works. Quietly, through generations, through work done in peace, not spite." He closed the book and smiled. A few weeks later, Joseph stood by the front gate. Watching Mara load her suitcase into a shared van for college, she turned to him, tears in her eyes but a fire in her chest. "Everything I am," she said softly, "is because you never gave up." Joseph placed a hand on her cheek. "No, love, everything you are is because you chose to rise." She hugged him tightly, then climbed in. The van pulled away slowly, disappearing into the horizon of early morning light. Back inside, the house felt still, not empty, just waiting. Joseph walked past the living room and paused beside the small wooden box on the shelf. He opened it. Inside were a few of the old letters Thomas had once written, the ones that had never been sent, but somehow made their way into his hands. He read one, then smiled, and finally placed the box on the top shelf, as if to say, that chapter is closed now. Years later, a plaque appeared on the wall of the community center, just a simple bronze rectangle. It didn't list awards, it didn't boast, it just read, "In honor of Joseph Ellis, a man who showed us that quiet dignity can move mountains." Kids still walked in and out, some running, some laughing, some hurting, but all welcome, because his legacy wasn't in the speeches he gave, but in the space he created and the light he left behind.